everybody. Today we're going to talk about the regulation of blood pressure. Okay, so we got to start out with a little bit of vocabulary. Your blood pressure is different in different parts of the cardiovascular system, and it's also different at different parts of the cardiac cycle. So we have to be clear about what we're talking about when we're talking about blood pressure. So this is a great illustration of how blood pressure changes in time, and then at the bottom of the slide across the different parts, the different blood vessels in the system. So blood pressure is going to be highest in the ventricles of the heart when they're contracting, and then in the arteries, and it declines throughout the system. Of course, the heart itself alternates between being at very high pressure when it's contracting, especially in the ventricles, and then at very low pressure right after it's contracted and when it's empty. It has to be this way because this is a closed system of fluid. And so the only way the fluid's going to continue to circulate is if we set it up this way, because any fluid will only move from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure. So the only way to get it to keep moving is to take one part of it to very high pressure so we can get it out of that part, and then to very low pressure so we can pull blood into that part, and that's what the heart does, of course. Okay, so the heart, as you can see on the left side of the slide, and this is the left ventricle specifically, alternates between periods of very high pressure when it's contracting and very low pressure. And then the blood's pushed out into the arteries, and the arteries also have an alternation in blood pressure, which you can feel as your pulse. And that damps down as you go through the system, so that by the time you get to the capillaries and the veins, there's no temporal change in blood pressure. It just decreases gradually throughout that system. Now, if we want to say, well, we don't really want to think about two different numbers, the systolic and diastolic blood pressure when we think about it. We just want to take the average number, the mean pressure, and we're going to take it in the arteries because that's where we can easily measure it. So the mean arterial pressure, here's the phrase here. And to determine what that is, you might think that you would just average the highest and lowest pressures, the systolic and diastolic. But we can't quite do that because the heart actually spends more time not beating than beating. So we have to weight it a little bit toward diastolic pressure. So the mean arterial pressure is the diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of the difference between them, the pulse pressure. In other words, instead of being halfway between diastolic pressure and systolic, it's 1/3 of the way up through that difference. Okay, so the mean arterial pressure is the average pressure in your arteries over time, and that's the thing we're going to talk about being regulated, the MAP. Okay, what determines that? Well, it's really two things. It's the amount of blood that comes out of the heart per minute or per unit time, that's the cardiac output, and then it's the peripheral resistance. So we'll start with cardiac output. Cardiac output has two determinants, stroke volume and heart rate. And then in a minute, we'll talk about peripheral resistance, which basically means how much space is there for blood flow in the blood vessels. Okay, so let's start with cardiac output. Cardiac output itself has two determinants, heart rate and stroke volume, because obviously the amount of blood coming out of the heart per unit time is simply the amount that comes out per beat times the number of beats. So the number of beats is quite straightforward. The heart rate is controlled exclusively almost by the autonomic nervous system. So you can see the parasympathetic input on the left side of the slide in blue, and then in the center of the slide, the sympathetic input to heart rate. So as you may already know, the sympathetic nervous system speeds up heart rate, and the parasympathetic system slows it down. The other input is a little more complicated. This is the stroke volume on the right side. So stroke volume is just the amount of blood ejected per beat. It also depends on sympathetic input. That is, the more the sympathetic nervous system is activated, the harder the heart beats, and that's going to make the stronger the force of the contraction, so the more blood will get squeezed out. And the sympathetic nervous system can also constrict veins. So as these veins return blood to the heart, if they are more constricted, that will essentially squeeze the blood back up toward the heart. The other side of stroke volume really has to do with how much blood there is in the system, and we'll talk a bit about that later, and then how quickly it's returning to the heart. So at the bottom right of the slide, we have skeletal muscle pump and respiratory pump. So these are things that would change during exercise that help return blood to the heart from the vein. So if you're just sitting here, as I'm sitting here, there might be some blood sort of pooling in the veins of my legs. But if I got up and did some jumping jacks, or even really just stood up, then you have an activation of the muscles in your legs, and when those muscles contract, as they contract, sort of incidentally, they are squeezing the veins inside them. And because veins have valves, any squeezing of blood always returns it in the direction of the heart. The respiratory pump is the same thing, except for the movement of one specific skeletal muscle, which is the diaphragm, and perhaps any additional respiratory muscles you might be using. So anything that squeezes blood back then toward the heart is going to increase what we call venous return, and that just literally means how much blood is returning from the veins, venous return. How much of that blood that's in the veins is actually returning per cycle, so between each individual heartbeat. And the more that there is returning from the veins, then the more they'll be in the ventricles when they're ready to contract. And that volume is called the end diastolic volume, the amount of blood in the ventricles just before they contract. The more blood that's in there, the more they stretch the myocardium, and the more it's stretched, the harder it snaps back, the harder it contracts. And so that's going to increase your stroke volume and cardiac output. So normally the way these interact is that there's some change in terms of the control of blood pressure. There's some change on the stroke volume side, and that's corrected by the autonomic nervous system on the heart rate side especially, and also on the contractility side. And let's see an example of that. So if you did begin to exercise, what would happen is that you would see an increase. So here what we're regulating is we want a regulated increase in blood pressure, because you're exercising, and so you want there to be a greater degree of glucose and oxygen delivery to your muscles, and a greater ability to remove carbon dioxide from those and other waste products from those tissues. So we want here, we're not bringing blood pressure back to normal, we want it to be higher. We're regulating it to a higher level, in the same way that when you're ill and you have a fever, that regulates your body temperature to a higher level. So we're aiming for a higher blood pressure here. And so the targeted systems when you exercise are the sympathetic nervous system especially, which remember is going to have these multiple effects on increasing cardiac output by increasing heart rate and venous constriction and contractility, as you can see here. And then exercise also, of course, means you're using your skeletal muscles, and so that's going to help squeeze blood back up toward the heart as well. We'll see that exercise also has an effect on peripheral resistance, the other side of blood pressure, but here are its effects on cardiac output. Okay, so part of what determines your blood pressure is how much blood is being added to the system per unit time. That's well, not added to the total system, but added to the arteries, which is where we're measuring blood pressure per unit time. That's your cardiac output. And then the other side of it is peripheral resistance. So basically, the way you want to picture this is we're just thinking about how much space is there for the blood that we're adding into the arteries from the heart. How much space is there in that system? Because if the arteries are really open and wide, then there's a lot of space for the blood, and it's not going to be at high pressure. The blood pressure will be lower. But if those arteries are pretty constricted, then that's going to increase the pressure there. So resistance can also be affected by other things. So it's affected by the length of the blood vessels and by the thickness or viscosity of the blood. But those two things don't generally change in a short-term way, and often they really don't change at all. The length of your blood vessels doesn't change much once you're an adult. So the one that's changing in the short term and that's used to regulate blood pressure is the radius of blood vessels. And this is a great tool to regulate blood pressure because, as you can see, resistance varies by the fourth power of radius. So even a very small change in radius will cause a huge difference in the resistance at that location. So by making these relatively small changes in resistance, we can end up with a big change in blood pressure. So it's a great way to quickly correct blood pressure if there's a change. So for example, if I stood up from my chair right now, my blood pressure would drop because suddenly gravity is making it more difficult to maintain my blood pressure. And so immediately, because this too is controlled by the nervous system, by the sympathetic nervous system mainly, if we get some immediate vasoconstriction, then my blood pressure can be returned to normal. So it's not always some big change like beginning to exercise. Simply changes in posture and so on are constantly detected and corrected through changes in heart rate and in stroke volume, but especially in resistance because it's such a powerful tool with that fourth power relationship. Okay, so make sure that you know these two vocabulary words. Vasoconstriction means that we're decreasing the diameter of a blood vessel, and vasodilation that we're opening it. Usually we use vasoconstriction and dilation to refer to arteries. Vaso just means the blood vessel itself. And then the phrase venous constriction, as you saw earlier, to refer specifically to what happens in veins. Okay, so if we put it together, what happens in the cardiovascular system if your blood pressure in this example is too high? So if your blood pressure is higher than the currently regulated level, as we see at the top here, that'll be detected by pressure receptors that you have both in the atria of your heart and in your arteries. And then the brain, specifically the medulla, will tell the autonomic nervous system, tell the sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons to change their activity in such a way that blood pressure is going to decrease. So specifically, we're going to increase the activity of the parasympathetic system if your blood pressure is too high, and we're going to decrease the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. So the result is these things we just saw. We're going to have vasodilation. So if my blood pressure is too high right now, I can open up those blood vessels and give the blood more space, and that lowers the blood pressure by lowering peripheral resistance. There's that there. And then by increasing the parasympathetic output, we can decrease heart rate, and we can decrease the force of contraction. And so we're going to decrease cardiac output. We're going to have less blood coming into the arteries per unit time. So with less blood coming in and more space for it to be in, we're going to end up with a lower blood pressure. Perhaps, obviously, the reverse happens if your blood pressure is too low. We would increase sympathetic output, cause vasoconstriction, cause the heart rate to go up, and decrease parasympathetic input as well. So whichever way you get a deviation from blood pressure, you can get an immediate activation of the autonomic nervous system to fix it. And again, this is just a part of daily life. This isn't in any extreme situation. Even a situation like exercise would be considered relatively extreme compared to just normal dated, moment to moment and minute to minute changes in blood pressure. Okay, but that all is indeed in the short term over these moment to moment, minute to minute changes in blood pressure. In the long term, so over a period of let's say minutes to hours, especially toward the hours end of things, there's another system that controls blood pressure. And that system is the renal system, or the kidneys, and they're controlling it by controlling the amount of fluid volume that's in this closed cardiovascular system. So in the cardiovascular system, it can change like how the blood is moving around in the system, but it can't add or subtract fluid from the system. Whereas the kidneys can. Well, they can't add it, but they can subtract it. So if we look at the stroke volume side of this, we know that one of the things that affects stroke volume is venous return, the amount of blood that's returning to the heart between beats. And although it's not shown directly on here, a big thing that contributes to that is simply the blood volume. What is the amount of blood that's in the system? Basically, how hydrated is the person? And the more hydrated they are, simply the greater the venous return is going to be. Blood volume is regulated primarily by the kidney. So imagine that we had decreased blood pressure, so top left of this slide here. And this slide is telling us about the role of the most important hormone in controlling blood pressure, which is vasopressin. The kidney actually has multiple ways of controlling blood pressure, but this is the most important one. So vasopressin, also known as ADH, antidiuretic hormone, is a hormone that's going to allow the kidney to basically retain water in the body and keep it away from becoming urine. So if you have decreased blood pressure, then we want this hormone to help us maintain the fluid volume that's in our body. How does the hormone know to do this? Well, if there's decreased blood pressure, then there's going to be decreased pressure and stretch both in the arteries themselves, so they're pressure receptors or baroreceptors in the arteries themselves, and there's also a stretch receptor in the atria of the heart, and these are going to be less activated. They're going to be sending fewer action potentials if you have lower blood volume. Then your hypothalamus finds out about that, and your hypothalamus actually produces vasopressin itself. So the lower the blood pressure, the more vasopressin it produces. It is released from the posterior pituitary and goes to the kidney, to the epithelial cells of the collecting duct of the kidney, and causes the insertion of aquaporins that allow the kidney to return most of the blood it's filtering, most of the blood volume it's filtering, back to the blood, basically to minimize the amount of fluid that's going into urine. Another hormone that you have that can also assist ADH in maintaining blood pressure is aldosterone. Now, aldosterone's main job actually is to control the osmolality or osmolarity of the blood, and blood pressure is kind of a secondary job that it has. But if blood pressure drops and the concentration or osmolarity of the blood is not too high, which sometimes happens when our blood volume drops, right, as it becomes more concentrated. But if the concentration is not too high, then aldosterone can help us maintain our blood pressure too, through a pathway that you can investigate further called the Ras Pathway. We get release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex, and that increases the amount of sodium that is reabsorbed into the blood from the kidney. And because water follows salt, as you know, you're going to get some additional water reabsorbed from the distal tubule of the kidney, and then also from interstitial fluid around the body into the blood, because there's a higher amount of sodium in it. So as fluid gets added to the blood, that will also increase your blood pressure again. So if we put it all together in a simple way, we can say that, so if we imagine that your blood volume and blood pressure are now, in this example, too high, whether they're too low or too high, whichever it is, that's going to be detected in these various ways that we've discussed. And then we have these two systems to control it. The short-term system, the cardiovascular system, which can change in various ways, as we saw, cardiac output, and it can also change how open and closed the blood vessels are. And then in the somewhat longer term, the kidneys can change the amount of salt and water that they are putting in the urine versus reabsorbing, and that can change the blood volume, and those things all affect blood pressure. So basically the left side of this slide is something that occurs in the shorter term, and the right side in the longer term. Note that the kidneys cannot add fluid to the system. The only way you can really add fluid to the system is by eating or drinking. So when we look at the slightly more complicated view of what happens here, we see that we've added something in the middle of the right side here, which is thirst. So the stimulus to drink is going to be the only way we're going to add fluid to this system. Otherwise, we see the reaction to low blood pressure via dehydration here. And so we have cardiovascular mechanisms that we talked about. We have the renal or kidney mechanisms that we talked about, and then we have the hypothalamus responding, as we saw, both with vasopressin, as just discussed, and with thirst. And so the result of all these, if in this example our blood pressure is too low, is to increase our cardiac output, to increase blood volume from drinking, to maintain, to lose as little as possible blood volume from the kidneys, and as the result, to maintain blood pressure. Again, this is going to be the opposite in a system where, in a situation where your blood pressure and volume were too high. Okay, so if you need to spend more time with any of these slides, do that, and let me know if you have some questions.